How will a Trump presidency affect the U.S. housing market? What does it mean if you're in the market to buy a home? In today's video, we're going to look at the effect of a Trump presidency on the U.S. housing market, and we're going to get started right now. I try to avoid politics on my channel. However, real estate is closely tied to government policy. Always understand, anytime you hear someone's take, it's their opinion. Nobody has a crystal ball. Remember, anytime you get information from any source, the person giving you that information is going to have some sort of bias, and that includes YouTube. At the end of the day, you have to do your own research, and you have to look at all sides of an issue and decide what's best for you and your family. After the election, half the country is thrilled, and the other half of the country is ready to move overseas. This is my take. It doesn't mean it's right. And if you could disagree, feel free to leave a comment, but please be respectful. Ultimately, your success in life is tied to your mindset and your actions. It's not who's in the White House. You should not base any real estate decision on who is in the White House. If you're waiting for someone in government to come to your rescue, you may be in for some real disappointment. And you've heard me say this 1,000 times. Buy a home you can afford when you're ready, and when you plan on being there for at least 5 years. And here's another thing to consider. Just because something is not directly related to housing doesn't mean that it won't affect the housing market. Take, for example, energy independence. President-elect Trump wants to drill for oil. Now, that's not housing policy, but the price of oil does affect the housing market. Let's take a look at energy independence. I think this will be a plus for the U.S. housing market. Drilling for oil and energy independence is going to reduce the cost of bringing goods to market. That's good for the economy. If more people have more money, that's good for business. More drilling means more jobs, which also helps drive the economy. Many of the products used in construction are petroleum-based products. The lower the cost of energy, the lower the cost of these products, which will be passed along to the consumer. I also think there's a mental side to this. When the price of gas goes up, it's like being taxed. When you have less money to spend, there's a natural tendency to pull back on spending. That way with individuals, and it also applies to businesses. Let's talk about number 2, less regulation. President-elect Trump is a pro-business person. 25% of the cost of a new construction home is tied to regulations. If you can remove the red tape, that's going to lower the cost to build, which is good for the consumer. Now, obviously, you need some sort of regulation. Hopefully, some common sense can prevail. Some of these regulations are set at a local level, and that's out of the control of the federal government. Trump also talked about opening up federal land. Currently, the federal government owns about 27% of the land nationwide. This land is located in the western United States. Trump talked about opening up this land for building. For example, 80% of the land in Nevada is owned by the federal government. That might work if the land is located near a population center. But if it's out in the middle of the Nevada desert, then who wants to live out there? Most people want to live near a population center. Anytime one party has a policy proposal, the other side is going to demonize it. People on the left will say, well, he plans to open up Yosemite National Park for development. I don't really see that happening. If President Trump decides to ease restrictions on the timber industry, which would increase the supply of lumber, that might ease the cost of construction. I'm sure the left will also push back on this. But if it can be done responsibly, then it could have some merit. One way or another, we need to build more homes. Let's talk about tax cuts. Now, the Trump-era tax cuts were set to expire in 2025. If those tax cuts were to expire, then we would have been looking at a tax increase. Now that President Trump is reelected, those tax cuts will be extended or be made permanent. Now, since businesses and individuals will have less money to spend on taxes, they can use this money for expansion. If businesses have more money to invest in their businesses, more expansion means more jobs, which is good for the economy. On an individual level, the less money spent on taxes means more money to spend on other things, which helps grow the economy. In addition to the Trump-era tax cuts, in the past few years, the Biden administration has had its eyes on eliminating the 1031 tax deferred exchange. Now, for those of you not familiar with a 1031 exchange, A 1031 exchange allows investors to defer paying capital gains taxes on the sale of investment property by reinvesting the proceeds into a like-kind property within specific timeframes. This helps investors preserve more capital for reinvestment and build wealth through real estate. If the 1031 exchange were to be eliminated, this would have a negative impact on real estate and economic growth. President Trump, with a background in real estate, would be an ally in maintaining the 1031 exchange, which is good for the economy and for the housing market. The economic impact of the typical home sale in the United States is $124,800 in 2023. Now let's talk about tariffs. Tariffs can be inflationary. When foreign goods cost more, that gets passed along to the consumer. It means the consumer has to pay more for that product. Prices going up are inflationary. If the consumer has to spend more on goods, it means less money to spend on housing. If a product is used in construction and it gets hit with a tariff, that will increase the cost to build, which means the price of homes will increase. Now, let's say he introduces a tariff on a foreign company that enables an American company to compete. Then that might not be as bad. More competition allows more companies to compete. When companies compete, that keeps prices down, which is good for the consumer. Here's another way to use tariffs. He can use the bully pulpit of the White House and the threat of tariffs to discourage companies from leaving the United States. For example, let's say you're a company in Ohio and you're planning on closing a plant and moving to Mexico because you want access to a cheaper workforce. If President Trump threatens that company with a massive tariff, that company is less likely to close down and move to Mexico. If someone decides to move to Mexico to save money and then gets hit with a massive tariff, that news is going to spread and you'll see more companies less likely to move overseas. This is good to keep jobs here in the U.S., which is good for the economy. Now, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. If we tariff another country, they can retaliate, and the next thing you know, we're in a trade war. Nothing happens inside a vacuum. Time will tell how this plays out. Now let's talk about mass deportation. President Trump plans to deport millions of illegal immigrants. What effect will these mass deportation have on the housing market? I think we can all agree that an open border with unchecked illegal immigration is bad policy. If you're seeking asylum, then go through a port of entry. Now, there's one school of thought that says less people means less demand for housing. That's true. However, I don't see someone who crossed the southern border from Guatemala in the market to buy a home. Now, what about the rental market? If demand goes down, prices will follow. It might have some impact. However, this is just my opinion. I have the belief that many who cross the southern border end up living with someone else. So I think the demand on rentals will be minimal. One of the concerns with many in the building industry is that it could lead to higher building prices because many of these workers in the building industry are undocumented workers. If those workers are lost, then it could hamper building and thus raise the cost to build. The question will be, will he deport someone working on a construction site or a member of MS-13? Now let's talk about interest rates. I know on the campaign trail that President Trump said he wanted to lower interest rates. Now, interest rates are controlled by the bond market. President-elect Trump has no control over interest rates. Now, I know President Trump is not a fan of the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. Now, I don't care if you're a Jerome Powell fan or not. The Federal Reserve has to remain independent. Now, one can argue, are they really independent? Jerome Powell has stated that he will not resign. If President Trump were to fire Jerome Powell, this would probably end up in the courts, and that would take time. Jerome Powell's current term is slated to end in May of 2026. Remember back in 2021, after we've spent a ton of money, you didn't have to be Milton Friedman in order to realize all of that spending was inflationary. Now, we were told at the time that inflation was transitory, which was a complete lie, and everybody knew it. I think it's fair to say that the Federal Reserve contributed to the problem. Now, hindsight is 2020, but when inflation took off in early 2021, the Fed should have raised rates earlier before inflation got out of control. If they had done that, then perhaps the wild market would have been tamed earlier and maybe home prices would not have gone up as much. Maybe interest rates would not have gone up as high. All of this is speculation. Nobody knows for sure. Now, if the economy takes off and things heat up, chances are interest rates will remain high. I could see rates staying higher for longer. Now, here's the deal. Nobody knows what interest rates will do. And remember, don't buy a house on the assumption that rates will be coming down. Then you can refinance. If you purchase a home, make sure you're comfortable with the payment at the interest rate you have. There's no guarantee that interest rates will come down. Now let's talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been in conservatorship since 2008. President Trump has talked about ending this and returning these entities back to the shareholders. Now, what exactly do Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae do? Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises, that help make home ownership more accessible by buying mortgages from lenders. This provides banks and other lenders with more funds to offer new home loans, thus ensuring a steady flow of affordable mortgage credit. Freddie and Fannie went into conservatorship during the GFC in 2008. Since then, they have recovered. In 2012, they became profitable. In 2017, both repaid their debts back to the U.S. Treasury. Now, many on the left want to maintain control of these because they have more influence on how they operate in order to push an agenda. At the time they were placed in conservatorship, it was meant to be temporary until they can get back on their feet. Depending on which side of the aisle you sit, ending conservatorship is going to seem irresponsible, while the other side is going to feel it's long overdue. If it makes money more available with less regulations, it's probably a good thing. Now let's talk about optimism. Now, during the campaign, 80% of the country felt that we were on the wrong track. The nice thing about a Trump presidency is that we've already had a Trump presidency. Back then, take out the pandemic, economically speaking, we did fairly well. Hopefully, Trump 2.0 has had 4 years to think about how to do things better. Hopefully, that translates to a successful presidency. So far, the markets are optimistic about Trump 2.0. If businesses are more optimistic, they will invest more money back into their business. That will lead to growth, and that will be a good thing for the economy. What do I think the overall impact will be on the housing market? I believe sales will increase next year. Rates might not come down much. Would I like to see them come down? Of course. If we could just get into that mid-5 range, I think many folks would come off the sidelines. No matter if rates do or do not decline, homes will be sold. Why is that? Because no matter who is in the White House, life is still happening. Last year, 3.5 million new babies were born, 1.5 million marriages, 700,000 divorces, 3.5 million people turned 65 years old. There were 2 million deaths and 25 million job switches. All of these are life events. Life events create real estate transactions. No matter who's in the White House, people will have to live somewhere. Now let's talk about the Department of Justice. For the last 4 years, the real estate industry has been under attack. In 2019, the Department of Justice opened an antitrust investigation into several policies of NAR regarding commissions. In November of 2020, the Department of Justice and NAR reached a settlement that included several policy changes. However, in 2021, the Department of Justice announced that it was withdrawing from that agreement and reopening the investigation. Since then, NAR filed a lawsuit, but the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the Department of Justice. NAR is now appealing to the United States Supreme Court. Now that Trump is in office, we will see a leadership change at the Department of Justice, which will probably be more friendly to the real estate industry. Now let's talk about efficiency. President Trump is looking at making government more efficient. Now, efficiency is good, but that's going to be tough because the people inside the government, they love that money, and no one likes to shrink the size of government. That applies to both sides of the aisle. We have a massive federal debt. Eventually, we have to come to terms that we can only kick the can down the road for only so long. Sooner or later, this has to be addressed. If the government can be made to be more efficient, that's good for everyone. That's going to be tough because no one in the government wants to cut their pet program. And I think some tough choices have to be made. Time will tell if President Trump will be successful at this.